Before I say that, let me say this in a few different ways. Happy Easter, there's English for you. Pasg, hapus, that's for Welsh, Happy Easter. Fogwood sit lock. Come on! Yeah, you don't know what that is, do you? It's Happy Easter in Cantonese. No messing about. And Easter Mubarak. Thank you very much. I'll be running classes later. I'm going to read to you a big chunk of the scriptures. It's going to come up. It's Luke chapter 24. And if you've got a Bible with you, fantastic. If not, it's going to come up on the screen. This is what it says. Now, that same day, two of them, disciples that is, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, all right, just trying, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. This is Jesus saying, "What things?" "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death. And they crucified him. But we had hoped," wow, "that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us." They still do. Sorry, some of our women didn't say that. "They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." He said to them, "How foolish you are. How slow of heart," meaning dull, "to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day's almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Oh, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It's true, the Lord has risen. He's appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Risen from the dead. It's almost too good to believe, and it's almost too difficult to believe. He showed the holes in his hands later to Thomas, who was a doubter, probably an engineer who worked at Royce's. A doubter who wasn't sure, scientific mindset. He needed to understand why and how this worked. But what do you think? And what do your neighbors and workmates think Easter is all about? Well, a slide's going to come up here and just say, show us a few things. There's an empty tomb. We love that. The next one. There's all kinds of ways that people evaluate what Easter's about. Clearly, it's about DIY. Approximately £4 billion is spent on DIY-related items at Easter. An average of 5 million people spend £900 on home improvements over Easter. Isn't that amazing? How many of you spent 900 quid on home improvements? Yeah, not many of us. Not coming to your house. Lots of improvements going on around the country. That's what most people think. Or maybe, okay, it's about bunnies and Easter eggs and chocolate. Over £415 million is projected to be spent on Easter eggs alone, with 80 million Easter eggs sold in the UK each year. How many of you got an Easter egg this morning? Yeah. How many of your kids got them? Yeah. Well, yeah, that was a bit tight. Not many. You've got to get into that, guys. So, Easter cards. Have you seen Easter cards in the supermarket? They're obsessively appalling. Now, some of them are nice, okay, I'll give you that, but some of them are like thinking of you at Easter, to pictures with teddy bears on them, and bunnies and rabbits saying, spring is here, happy Easter. You're going, spring is here? You're missing the point. Occasionally, Easter eggs, I think Easter eggs win hands down over empty tomb pictures or the cross or anything to do with Jesus, effectively. Because it's a Christian festival, but I think most people forget that. I read a little while ago that while many Brits understand that Easter is a Christian festival, 48% of them don't know what it was that was celebrated. That's half. It's probably worse than that. That's a couple of years old. In Liverpool, where I grew up, Easter was about when, well, basically, if you were a Protestant, it was a bit tougher on you than if you were a Catholic. If you were a Catholic, you got new clothes at Easter. Anyone recognize that? Thanks, Karina. Always me and you, Karina. Catholics get new clothes at Christmas. They get trips, everything. They get money. They get all kinds of things. And Protestants were just told, stop smiling. Stop having fun. This is not, you're not meant to enjoy Christianity. You're meant to grind your way through it. And that is the truth. But one year, I remember as I grew up, I remembered, this is going to age me, and some of you who respond, I watched Jesus of Nazareth on the telly. Anyone? Thank you. Look at the age of you. And Jesus of Nazareth was a TV series, but it gripped the nation. At the same time, there was Roots on the other side. And there was a bit of a struggle in our house. My dad wanted to watch Roots. We all wanted to watch Jesus of Nazareth. We watched both. Because whoever got closest to the telly kept switching it over. There was no remotes in those days. There was barely electricity. And I remember watching Jesus of Nazareth with my parents, and something began to make sense. And when Jesus was unjustly treated on Good Friday, and when he went to the cross, I remember thinking to myself, that's not right. That seems wrong to me. It would take me another 10 years from that point before I finally understood that Jesus was alive and that he died for me and that I could have a relationship with him. And the church was a gathering of people who had experienced the life of Jesus, and it wasn't just a gathering of people who had nothing better to do on a Sunday morning. I was just always DIY. But you guys have come here today, and I wonder what drew you. Is it the fact that, well, you know, I go at Christmas and Easter, it's great to turn up and remind myself I tick the Christian box? Or is it different to that? Have you come because actually you've missed being part of the family of God, and it seemed today that this was the day you said, new start? Maybe it's post-COVID and you think, I've had enough of COVID now. It feels like I need to get back. I've been worried, I've been nervous, but I'm back and I'm coming to be part of the people of God. Or this is your first time. You came to Holly's kids thing. That sounded great, by the way. Holly's party yesterday afternoon. And you said, you know what? That seemed like a fun place to be. I'm going to come back and bring the kids with me. Christianity is not airy-fairy, some religious lofty ideal. The Christianity you see in the Bible, the actual place where you find out what's going on and what Christians believe, because this is where it works itself out, it's gritty. It's real. It takes place in ordinary lives, in working people's lives who've got the same struggles, but in different ways than you and I have today. Whatever else is going on at Easter, despite all these other things, you can wipe the idea from your mind that it's a mere fairy tale or a myth and that it's got nothing to do with you. Risen from the dead. Could it possibly be true? Well, let's read the story and just focus a little bit on what we've heard already this morning. Just want you to look at the question that Jesus asks them in verse 17. What are you discussing together as you walk along? They're walking along, two disciples, down the road, they are gutted. They're walking from Jerusalem, and they're going back probably to their home village in Emmaus. It's about 7 miles away. They probably discussed on the way the events of the weekend that had left their leader hanging limp and pale on a blood-stained wooden cross. He was hurriedly buried before the Passover, before Sabbath, and they were utterly discouraged. No one's career and message had ever been so thoroughly defeated and discredited in the public eye as had that of Jesus. Even his disciples and his closest friends had left him and fled. Indeed, he'd been betrayed into the hands of the ecclesiastical and governmental authorities by one of his closest friends. The hopes of his disciples were in shreds. The disciples didn't get those messages he'd been sending about Jesus needing to suffer, the Christ needing to suffer before he enters into his glory. They didn't get it. It didn't compute because we rarely hear things we don't want to hear. Our emotional programming pushes it away and says, I don't want to hear that. And we invent new narratives to avoid truth and reality. Now, as they walk, on the very day they're leaving, there are some reports that his body was stolen. And the two disciples had heard about some of their own number. The women had gone to the tomb, and not finding the body of Jesus, they began to wonder what had happened. It didn't occur to them, a bit dull, it doesn't occur to them that if the woman's report about the empty tomb were true, then their report that Jesus had risen from the dead might also be true. The confused and disgruntled disciples were paralyzed by disappointment and grief. Hiding his identity, Jesus appears as a stranger, a fellow traveler along the road, and asks, friends, what are you talking about? He says, the things in Jerusalem, friend, traveler. What things? Well, about Jesus of Nazareth. And they began to explain what those things were. And look at verse 24. We had hoped. Probably back one, I think. Oh, no, it's there. Good. Well done. Thank you. 24, 21. It says, we had hoped. Oh. Have you ever hoped that something would happen? Given yourself into that hope and then discovered or found that it just didn't happen? You hope that wicked regimes fall. You hope that wars end. You hope that the relationship tensions in the house cease. And they just don't. And it leaves you in a position where you're just not quite sure where to turn. You don't know what to do next. We had hoped, and they had hoped all the way in. 100%. And when hope goes, it can destroy you. It can crush you because human beings are predisposed to hope. We desire it. We need it. We've got to think about, we have a hope for the future. And these two fellows were disillusioned. They were fearful. After all, their leader had been killed, and their movement, that can finish a movement off right there when the leader is killed. When my first wife, Helen, died, it was after a period of suffering and sickness that had lasted 2 years in the second bout of cancer and about 1.5 years in the first bout. Me and my family and many of you in this church and others across the world hoped together that Jesus would heal her. And he didn't. Well, not in the way that I wanted. Ultimately, Jesus did heal her by taking her to himself. And where there is no more pain and no more suffering, and one day, I'll see her again. And she will have a new body, she'll be free from pain, and she'll be free from suffering. But the faith question remains, doesn't it? What do you do with suffering? What do you do with pain? What do you do with struggle? What do you do with heartache? And I think the test for us and my family was, do we stop believing now, or do we believe even more? Do we press into the only one who's never let us down, who said he'll never leave us or forsake us, or do you just say, it doesn't work? These two fellas are in the it didn't work, it doesn't work camp. They walked away because life got gritty and their expectations had not been fulfilled. What are you hoping for? Where have you been disappointed today? What are you living in right now? How are you doing? Is life not so peachy? That if Jesus is not there in the suffering, if he's not there in the pain and the struggle, then you may have a cause to say, this doesn't work. But the truth is that Jesus was right there in the midst of our loss when we lost Helen. Jesus was right there in our pain and our struggle. Jesus was there when we didn't understand, but we did understand this, that we were going to cling on to him because he'd never let us down. And he was faithful and he was true. And all the years that I'd followed him, I'd said, God, you are the only one who's never let me down. And I will trust you, even if right this minute I don't comprehend what to do next. Do you feel like sometimes you've been left behind? Perhaps you've got challenges in relationships. It feels like perhaps you feel like you're alone, maybe even hungry, unloved, abandoned, isolated. The career move didn't work. The retirement that you'd hoped for didn't work out. It's been much harder than you believed. And fate, or Murphy's Law, the idea that something's going to get you in the end. And you live under this kind of wave or thought kind of process that keeps you trapped. And when Dave T talked about that binding around a person earlier, I thought that doesn't just apply to one person, that applies to many of us this morning. And the resurrection breaks it off. Jesus' death and on the cross took all of it, as it were. He was as bound as any person could have been, bound with all the sin of the world upon his shoulders, all the suffering and struggle that human beings had ever gone through from before he was born and from afterwards was wrapped around him. And the resurrection of the tomb said, get off. No more will I be bound by sin and its entanglements. And I'm not going to be trapped in a moment of time where God didn't seem to do what I wanted. He's bigger than that. And he loves you more than that. Life is not, being a Christian is not a guaranteed, hassle-free, no problems, win the lottery, Grand Slam, Champions League winning, never-ending success story, but rather a case of living with human weakness and the God who raises the dead. That's what this is about. Jesus says, have a drink. Verse 25. How foolish you are. How slow you are to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wow. The disciples we encounter who are hearing this are just like us. They've lost the plot. They're confused, think themselves foolish for having trusted in the first place. They're at the utter end of their own resources, feeling that the hope they had was misplaced. Jesus says, did you not hear me? Did you not understand what I was saying? Suffering is part of Christianity. Going through death to experience life. What's God been saying to you about trust? What's God been saying? Well, Jesus then, in verse 29, moves on and says this. The disciples say, invite him to sit down. And then Jesus begins to explain again to these guys from Moses, from all of the revelation in the Old Testament. He speaks to them, which is the only testament they had, speaks to them and says, this is the way it's always been meant to be. Let me show you how it is. And the scriptures tell us that their hearts are illumined. Their eyes are opened and they see. But they go on to talk about how their hearts are burning as they listen to him. He illuminates their hearts through explaining the scriptures. Isn't it interesting that, imagine that you've been raised from the dead. What would you do with, the next 12 hours? Well, Jesus decides to hang around in a garden and wait for a woman to come and Mary to come and have a little chat with her. That's what Jesus does post-resurrection. He has a chat in a garden with a woman. And then later on the same day, he decides he's going to walk along a dusty road with some guys who are a bit disappointed. That's one person over here and two people over here. I think marketing men and women would be saying, what a mistake. What on earth are you thinking? Look, let's get you on the evening news. Maybe you could just fly into Jerusalem. Turn up at Pontius Pilate's palace. Say hello to the guys at the Sanhedrin. Hey, you were wrong. Jesus doesn't appear like that because he's not like that. He comes along, he sees the individual, he sees you, and he wants to come alongside you today in your struggles as you're walking away, as it were, or as you're looking kind of, what do I do next? As those women approached that tomb in the morning, what were they expecting? I don't think they were expecting angels to roll stones away and a gardener to come and speak to them, who turns out to be Jesus, who's risen from the dead. And I don't think those two blokes going to Emmaus believed that Jesus would walk with them, little guys. We've got Cleopas, but we don't even know the other fella's name. And Jesus, the risen Jesus, speaks to them. Don't you dare say to anybody, Jesus hasn't got time or space for me. He wants to walk with you today, and he'll find you right where you are. Right in the middle of your life, he'll come alongside you if you invite him. Cleopas says, just don't go on. Don't keep going on your journey. Just stay with us for a bit. So he sits with them, and he begins to speak, and then he breaks the bread. Two things. First thing is, reading the scriptures brings you illumination. I think some of us were struggling with the old Holly's little kind of quiz today because we don't read the scriptures very much, so we don't know the story. Scripture brings you illumination. It means you are illuminated. Your mind, it's called enlightenment, really, but it's not the enlightenment that we had because that wasn't very enlightening. But this is when your heart begins and your whole face and your whole heart begins to go, oh my goodness. Catherine and I do Lectio 365 every morning and evening. We sit there, and I don't know how many times over the course of the last year that we've sat there and gone, wow, never seen that before. Read the story, I don't know how many times. Read the Gospels, don't know how many times. And each time you read it, it's like, wow, hadn't understood that before. Secondly, when you open the scriptures, you can not only expect God to speak to you, but also you can expect God to show you things for other people. When you come here on a Sunday, come more than once a year. Come more than twice a year. Don't be those people who come only once every month. You're missing out, and we're missing out. Don't neglect meeting with one another, because you've got something to offer, and you've got something that we need in this church. We need you. We don't need you to just do rotas. We just need you and your contribution, the gift that God's put in your life. And we need that. And thirdly, it's around a table. Illumination, opening of scriptures, and then they sat round a table breaking bread. We did communion today for the first time in 300 years. And it was tricky getting that. Anyway, there was no issue there. Jesus takes the bread, opens it off. And it's like, oh my goodness. Whenever you break bread, and I want to encourage you to do this, if you're waiting for it to happen in here as the only time you ever do it, you're missing out on revelation. When you break bread at home, when around the table, when you're sitting there, you can learn a lot round the table about the Lord. Break the bread, open it, begin to celebrate the body and blood of Jesus Christ at home. You say, I'm not a priest. I say, yes, you are. You're a royal priest. You have exactly the tools required according to Jesus, never mind some religious system. You're a priest. You're allowed to do just that. Break the bread, round the table, at home, and drink the wine together and remind yourself daily. As often as you meet together, it says. We just don't do it like that, sadly. But I do think that that's something that you should do, whether you live on your own, whether you live with others. Invite people round the table. We are about to start next week in our church here a Coming Home series. I don't know if we'll ever stop having the series. I think we'll just keep going for a long time. I don't mean technically, I just mean it feels like we should always be a place of welcome. Come home to Jesus. Go home to Jesus. Invite Jesus to sit at your table and let him speak to you. You can learn a lot round a meal table. Later, the disciples acknowledged to one another their hearts were burning. And they ran 7 miles back to Jerusalem. As soon as he'd gone, they ran. You're going, you're kidding me. And people say, well, you know, the resurrection is not real. It can't be true. They just imagined it and they're making it up. Well, something made those guys run back. I mean, I'd have got a taxi, wouldn't you? I mean, it's 7 miles. Uber. It's a long way to go when you've trudged out, but you're sprinting back within a couple of hours. What's the emotional and mental process that's taken place to enable that to happen? Some people say, well, you know, there's no evidence for the resurrection. Hang on a second. People said that what was clear was Jesus' body was missing. Well, if the Jews could have found it, if they could have stilled the preaching of Jesus and the resurrection that filled Jerusalem straight away, but they couldn't find the body. The body wasn't stolen. The Romans had no motive to steal the body. The Jews had no motive to steal the body. Oh, the disciples stole it, some people say. Well, there are a few guards around the tomb at the time, Roman guards. And the disciples' initial belief when the women brought them news early that Easter morning suggests that they were not in the mood or in the emotional state to steal the body of their dead Savior. It was over. I'm going home. If the disciples, let's just say, if the disciples had stolen the body, you wouldn't have expected them to then go on and risk their own lives. People generally don't die for what they know is not true. But the disciples put their lives on the line, and nearly all of them eventually were martyred for their faith. They believed it. Also, fourthly, the church mushroomed in size in Jerusalem. The very place where he was crucified, followers of Jesus in the city of Jerusalem grew from a few hundreds to thousands upon thousands soon after Jesus' resurrection and filled the known world. On the back of a lie? That somebody knew that the body had been stolen? I don't think so. Contemporary documents refer to the event. Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, all mention Jesus and refer to him. Jewish historian Josephus writes about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. They knew something had happened. Since the day he was raised from the dead, people have been trying to put him back in the tomb. But he's alive. And he will not be put down by religion or by people's best philosophies. He will not stay out of our lives. But if you invite him in, then you are going to get more than you bargained for. Bukharin, one of the most powerful men on earth in the early 20th century, was a Russian communist leader. He took part in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. He went from Moscow, listen to this, to Kiev in 1930 to address a huge crowd. The subject, of course, was atheism. He insulted and attacked Christianity. He argued. He labored his points. And at the end of the talk, he was confident that he had convinced the crowd that they should reject Christ and embrace atheism. So he turned the meeting back to the priest. The priest complimented him on his eloquence. Then turning to the crowd, he dismissed them by saying, "Christ is risen." Indeed. And they, with one thundering voice, replied, "He is risen indeed." An hour of communist rhetoric in Ukraine felt like he'd done the job. And with one single phrase, all of it was undone. You can't kill Jesus again. Empires will not be able to crush him out of existence, whether that's a communist one or whether that's an alternative religion. It doesn't matter. Jesus is alive, and he's alive today. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is actually more plausible than any other explanation. And that's why Christians today make such a big deal about Easter. You'll see it later. You'll see the Pope speaking in St. Peter's Square, I'm sure. Listen, that's why we celebrate. So, and I'm coming in to finish. Since Jesus is not dead, we can encounter him today. You can know him through a personal relationship. You can have a friendship with him now. So I'm going to ask you, would you join me and stand to your feet? If you're not sure that you can really say you've met this risen Jesus, then perhaps you might find him for yourself today. Not only here, we'll give you the opportunity in a moment, but also on the way home in the car or on the bus or as you walk. Be careful of strangers who come alongside you and say, "Hey, what are you talking about?" This is the heart of Christianity. There is no Christianity without a risen Savior. So I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray a prayer similar to the one I prayed when I became a Christian. I would invite you to join me in praying it as a restatement of your faith this morning. A recommitment to your trust in him.